Good morning. Good morning to everybody, and thank you very, very much indeed for giving me the opportunity to discuss this problem with you and to report back to you on a study which we have been conducting. But I particularly would like to thank you for your invitation to participate in such an eminent platform discussion. I think it will be very instructive for me to hear from experts and from parliamentarians as to how they would advise we deal with this problem. So thank you very much. Next slide, please. So this is a little background. When we talk of 5G, we are not, as you know, talking about a new technology, but rather of an evolution of technology which exists already, which has developed from 1G to 4G, with which we're more familiar. So how is it distinguished in nature? 5G networks will work with several different frequencies from less than 1 gigahertz to 3.6 gigahertz or 25 gigahertz. As Ms. Rivasi has said, some of these frequencies have been or are currently being used for earlier mobile communication generations and were studied for their health impact. Much higher radio frequencies are, however, planned for use at 5G evolution, 100 and more micrometers, and they have different characteristics. So these frequencies, the lower frequencies, less than 1 gigahertz and 3.6 gigahertz, have the same characteristics as the wavelengths that we're already familiar with and which we currently use. In terms of their impact on health, we have some studies available now. The best evidence that we have from all being published and reviewed on health is informative, but it's based on this range of wavelengths. In terms of the higher frequencies, as colleagues have said, more research is necessary and will indeed be done in the future. It's been very difficult for us to study it adequately up till now because it wasn't widely used, so we weren't able to get representative information. We didn't have enough individuals covered by the requisite wavelengths, and we didn't have any studies on animals and animal health either. We concentrated on the non-thermal effects. ICNIRP drafted guidelines in 1998, which were updated most recently in 2020. And these guidelines give a detailed and exhaustive analysis of all possible effects related to heating of animal tissue and human tissue. But the biological effects of a non-thermal nature have not been studied in the same detail for a number of reasons. First of all, the non-thermal effects are known to exist for sure. We are absolutely certain about this because electromagnetic fields operating in some of the frequencies which are used for mobile telephony are applied also in medicine for therapeutic purposes. And they're used precisely because we know that they have a positive interaction with the animal or human tissue which is to be treated. So we have been structuring our study in a particular way. This is the methodology here. The studies have been divided into two groups. We've had to look at a large number of studies which have been done. We've tried to select the most informative parameters. We've divided the studies into two groups in the first instance, one on the lowest frequencies and one on the higher frequencies. And so for the first one, as I was saying, we have found that there is a certain amount of evidence for the bandwidth from 24 to 100 gigahertz, the higher frequencies. We have not got sufficient information. And we had to structure our studies in this way because of the different characteristics of the various frequencies and the different impact Next slide, please. So now on the criteria for evaluation. This is the basis on which we've structured our work for scientific reasons, because we wanted to be absolutely objective and scientific on this and use well-established familiar criteria. So we based our criteria on the IARC preamble and the criteria there, which have actually been in use for some 40 years now and are based on particular chemical and physical observations. So we look at evidence in humans, epidemiological studies, evidence in animals, which has been carried out to some extent, and then we integrate these evaluations to get an overall evaluation, as we call it, of the impact. We therefore have to evaluate each series of studies independently, and then we have to correlate it with other studies, so that we then have 3 separate evaluations as a base, which are then integrated to give us the overall final classification, whereby we're able to look at the scientific impact and potential adverse effects deriving from exposure. Next slide. So, when we began to cross-reference the data and look at all the information that we have gleaned from thousands of publications on which our research has been based, when we began to narrow it down to the studies which were appropriate for experimental use, we reached a number of conclusions, as IARC had done, evaluating all the work available up to from 2011 to 2020 and updating the results that they had done, so that we now have a range of evidence up to 2020. We reached some conclusions. They may be limited to some extent and have some reservations, but we have observed that glioma, a tumour of the brain, and acoustic neuroma may be caused by exposure to radio frequency radiation from wireless phones. The human evidence is still limited, and I should add that no adequate studies have been performed on the effects of the higher frequencies. Next slide. We have carried out experiments on animals, and we have looked at carcinogenicity, and we have, to do this, updated the evidence which had been compiled by IARC up to 2011, which gave some clear results. At that point, there were not a large number of studies, but the studies which were carried out were considered to be perfectly valid, but requiring further analysis. So now we have the National Toxicology Programme study, which is more recent, having been published in 2018. And we also have a review of that done by a number of experts who have published their analysis and final report on this. And the conclusions that they have reached is that there is clear evidence of carcinogenicity, and that there is an evidence of an increase in brain tumours, and there are impacts on the Schwann cells of the peripheral nervous system. So these are the same types of tumours which were observed in epidemiological studies too on human beings. Therefore, the more recent studies do indeed seem to confirm what was identified in earlier epidemiological studies, both DP studies in America and subsequent studies which have been done by the Institute in Bologna more recently. As far as the higher frequencies are concerned, again, we feel that we do not yet have adequate study results on athermal effects as yet. Next slide. So now reproduction and development effects in human. Because, as I said, we have identified cancer as an endpoint, and we have looked further at adverse impacts on development, because these are two objective observations which have been confirmed by studies. If you look at pathologists' studies globally, you will see that there has been diagnosis of quite a number of types of tumour which are not obviously medically diagnosed. They're not self-reported, and there is laboratory evidence to back this up. The same is true on fertility. Sperm counts remain the same in all the laboratories which have been carrying out these studies. As far as the epidemiological studies have shown, there is limited evidence of adverse effects on the fertility of men. And the studies which have borne this out have been validated by a number of experts. The point being that it would appear that it is the ability of the sperm to reach its destination, to swim far enough and strongly enough to reach its destination, which is compromised. There have also been a number of different studies, developmental studies, that is to say, on neurological and cognitive development of children. Children who were born to mothers who used mobile phones a lot during pregnancy. Now, again, this is a review which has focused on lower bandwidths because there were no studies, again, on the higher frequencies. Next slide, please. Thank you. So, the results. These are based on experiments on animals. There have been control groups in a controlled environment, and the effect on fertility in the male rat and the male mouse have been clearly established. So there is sufficient evidence of adverse effects on fertility in a male rat and in the male mouse. There is more limited evidence of adverse effects on female mouse fertility. Not rats as yet, but in mice. And there is limited evidence of adverse effects on the development in the offspring of both rats and mice, which were exposed during the period of gestation, whilst embryos in utero. Once again, for the higher frequency bandwidths, we don't have adequate studies for further research conclusions at the moment. So the final conclusions there are these. We have integrated the studies from the epidemiological studies, the evaluation of the experimental studies, and we've integrated all the data and reached the following conclusions. So the current frequencies, which are higher than the lower ones, which were at the moment, these conclusions are based on best evidence, I should say. Probably these frequencies 450 to 6,000 are probably carcinogenic to humans. 24 to 100, again, we don't have adequate studies as a basis to evaluate fully the potential adverse impact, but it would appear that both for man and possibly for women, there can be an adverse impact on the development of embryos, fetuses and newborns. So the concern is that in the male there is a correlation between exposure and the effect on the quality of the sperm, and the concern for women is the impact on the development of embryos, fetuses and newborns when the mother has used a mobile phone extensively during pregnancy. Once again, and the higher frequencies, we don't have any adequate studies on the thermal, non-thermal effects. So now, next slide, on to the policy options. Opting for novel technology for mobile phones that enables RF and EMF exposures to be reduced. 61 voltmeter is the basis for our further consideration, looking at the thermal and non-thermal impact. We know that as far as men are concerned, the intense use of the mobile phone does have an impact, and therefore one of the first things which should be done, and perhaps the easiest thing to do, would be to ask mobile phone companies to produce phones which have less of an impact, which emit less energy and therefore expose the body less. This could be done in a quite straightforward fashion. For example, the phone would only be able to emit radiation when it was a certain distance from the body, and also to limit the levels of radiation. Our studies are based on thermal levels, and we've looked in detail in our studies at a number of different radiation levels, and the lowest dose which has an impact on Schwann tissue is 50 voltmeters, which could be actually considered the lower level. In the way that we do for chemicals, this is the lowest level where we have identified adverse impacts and emissions. So we need to look at exposure, and we need to look at what recommendations we could be making. We can't be using 5G exclusively through cable, but we do need to look at what sort of connectivity we provide in public places, in schools, in libraries, for example, and in the public space in general. And as Michelle Rivasi has very rightly flagged up already when she spoke earlier, we need a lot more scientific research of a multidisciplinary nature. We just don't have enough as yet. So we need to have more studies by physicists and in industry and by independent scientists. And what we need to do is have all these studies run in parallel and in conjunction, so that we can then extrapolate from all these different sources the appropriate conclusions, so that we can really make progress on understanding what the potential health impacts are of 5G, which is, after all, going to be all pervasive right around the globe. We've already got mobile phone networks very widely disseminated throughout the globe. I've looked at a lot of biographical information, doing literature reviews, and I've seen that there is a certain amount of monitoring going on as to the impact of these mobile phone networks. I'm extremely concerned about this, and I'm extremely motivated by this research, and I think the citizens don't have any kind of idea what is up ahead of us. It's not just the frequencies which have an impact, it's also the magnetic fields that are generated which have an impact, and therefore they should be limited. So rather than having new frequencies, newer frequencies which will have greater efficiency, we need to be looking at the health aspect and limiting it so that we can protect the health of our citizens. I'd like to thank you very much indeed for your attention, and thank you again for this wonderful opportunity. Thank you.